What comes to mind when I say the names Harlan, Rowe, Bousfield, Stevenson?
Well, I think of the first four headmasters at Brisbane Grammar School. 156 years ago, the grammar school was established in Brisbane. You've got all this merchant class who are looking to educate their children. So there was a vision there, to provide education for people's children.
It's arguably the most prestigious and categorically the most successful in terms of academic tertiary entry scores. $70 million top line revenue. You have stakeholders still answerable to the government. You've got senior leadership team, you've got employees as teachers. You have a school brand to manage always.
That whole notion of what our vision is to be the best school for boys in Australia. That drives our thinking, it drives our strategy, it drives our operations. But getting to know people and getting to understand their motivations, that builds that rapport, and then you have that level of trust, and then you're able to channel the energy of the group in a certain way. And for the parents, it gives them enormous satisfaction to watch their children succeed.
Welcome to the Success Times Happiness podcast, a platform dedicated to engaging discussions with inspiring individuals aimed at nurturing personal development. I'm Richard Thompson, your host, a father, entrepreneur, world champion Ultraman, and passionate about all things high performance. Our mission is to empower both ourselves and you to unlocking our fullest potential, recognizing that this life is no dress rehearsal. While I may not have all the answers, this show serves as our collective journey to uncover them. Today, we sit down with Anthony Micallef, the Headmaster of Brisbane Grammar School. He is a remarkable leader and educator who has spent over 3 decades shaping minds at the most prestigious school in Brisbane. Starting out as an English teacher, Anthony isn't just a headmaster. He's a visionary who has continuously elevated the school to new heights while staying grounded in his core belief that education is more than just academics. His passion for leadership, community building, and excellence makes him an inspiring figure to all who meet him. Expect to learn the key high-performance leadership strategies that he implements on a daily basis, the insights into balancing academic rigor with the emotional well-being of students and staff, how Anthony has successfully led Brisbane Grammar through its darkest days, and the role of continuous improvement in sustaining a high-performance environment, and much, much more. All right, this is a great episode. I hope you really enjoy it. Let's get into it. Anthony Micallef, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
What comes to mind when I say the names Harlan, Rowe, Bousfield, Stevenson?
Well, I think of the first 4 headmasters at Brisbane Grammar School. It's interesting to think that, 156 years ago, the grammar school was established in Brisbane. And I think back to what Brisbane must have been like then, because it's not long after the state of Queensland was established. And you've got all this merchant class who are looking to educate their children. So there was a vision there, to provide education for people's children. But at the time, to establish a single-sex school, obviously at a time when educating the boys was considered far more important. I often find it quite interesting that the girls' school was established fairly early on as well. They're celebrating their 150th. And I thought that was, again, visionary in the sense that it was important to establish education for both genders.
Back in that time.
And what I find particularly interesting, it was done off the back of subscriptions by people living in Brisbane at the time who approached a very young and naive government and said, we want to establish a school. And the government was prepared to reciprocate. And for every £1 donated, £2 were also contributed by the government at the time. And the first Brisbane Grammar School was established at North Quay in 1868, and the first kids walked through the gates in 1869. And then by 1881, the school had been moved to the top of the hill because North Quay was going to become the railway line which linked Ipswich to Brisbane. And Ipswich was at that point going to be the capital of Queensland.
Some real history.
Yeah, and then I think about each of those heads, and I have this fascination with Bousfield because I think it must have been an extraordinarily difficult time for the head to watch boys graduate and go straight off to war, right? And, I read stories about him sort of standing at assembly and reading out those who had perished, and I think to myself, what a waste. right? These boys have graduated after their parents have invested in that sort of education.
Mm.
They go off to battle in a faraway land and not return. And here's the headmaster who has this strong affinity with them, acknowledging contribution that they made, the ultimate contribution to their country and to freedom and democracy.
And now Micallef.
Yeah, that doesn't quite fit, does it?
That's unfair. That's unfair.
Well, it's, if you look at the history of the school, the names are very much Anglo-Saxon, and then all of a sudden there's this odd one.
Well, that's probably a theme of hopefully today's chat about your journey and who you are, and because you've been in that role for the last decade.
It's true. Yep.
It's easy to say, oh, you're the headmaster of a school, but what's on your shoulders, like, as you said, Brisbane Grammar is the oldest school in Brisbane. It's arguably the most prestigious and categorically the most successful in terms of academic tertiary entry scores.
Yep.
Your role is essentially a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company or enterprise.
Yep.
Public knowledge, $70 million top line revenue. You have stakeholders. You're still answerable to the government. You've got senior leadership team. You've got employees as teachers. You have a school brand to manage always. And the commodity that you're dealing with, the widgets that you're selling, is one of the most important things you can do. Is provide education to children. How do you reflect in that role of the last 10 years?
Well, it's interesting when I look at it. My background was an MA, BA, Dip Ed. So my master's is actually in literature. And I often joke that I didn't get much formal training in business doing a master's in literature. But when you step into those roles, you come at it from, this is what I know and this is what I've got to learn. So I knew the school, I knew its culture, I knew its people, I knew the strong affinity with the old boys, a parent body that are totally engaged. I'm blown away by their generosity, time, treasure, talent, prepared to give to the school. So there's this really strong connection with those two bodies, with the parent body and the Old Boys Association. And they believe very strongly in what the school has to offer. So, that makes my role a tad easier. The business side of the school is something that educators don't like to talk about. But as you say, it's a mid-tier company. And with it comes all of the complexities, everything from legislative regulations right through to legal considerations, insurance, as you say, managing brand and reputation. So it's quite a complex organisation. And what I find is the best way to manage that is to surround yourself with very capable people who are experts in their particular field. And you made mention of a senior leadership team. The people in that team are extraordinary. I won't name them, but they are experts in operations, finance, IT, academics, research and development, sport and activities. Got a head of middle school and a head of senior school who look after two fairly large school now because the school's nearly 2,000 students. There's nearly 500 employees when you include all of your seasonal coaches. The school runs an education program as well as maintenance, grounds, cleaning, catering, security. Security's outsourced, but, they're very much part of our community. And so there are all of these other operations that are going on simultaneously. And then you've got a huge business and services staff, right, who are operating in the background. And I think one of the things that perhaps we forget as teachers is in the background is this incredible group of people who are making certain that the classrooms, the facilities, the ovals, everything that we use is of a high quality, right? So there's genuine respect within the staff that we are working together and the common goal is the school's vision to be the best school for boys in Australia. That's what we want. I have a more global view than just the best school for boys in Australia, and that's why I contribute quite heavily to the International Boys School Coalition, because there's opportunities for our boys and for our staff to experience what it's like to be on that global stage, to present at international conferences, to...
Why limit just to Australia?
Yeah, but, that whole notion of what our vision is to be the best boys school for boys in Australia. That drives our thinking. It drives our strategy. It drives our operations. And it's also about continuous improvement because it forces you to think about, well, a high-performing organisation has to be constantly looking at its policies, its processes and practices, in order to support the people, right, places or the infrastructure and the educational programs that you want to deliver.
It's great. It's wonderful to hear that for a high-performance environment, it takes everyone. You're no more important than the team who's cleaning or the team that's looking after the grounds.
Yeah.
It's everyone's contributing. Everyone has a role to play. And if anyone breaks down, you're as weakest, the weakest link will pull everyone down.
Yeah. Well, look, if you look during COVID, our cleaning staff were extraordinary. They were cleaning around the clock to make sure that the school was appropriate and, well catered for. And, we were able to celebrate their contribution. Now, COVID's gone, but those people are still there and they still contribute to the well-being of our organisation.
Take me back, childhood.
Yeah.
Country New South Wales?
No, originally born in North Queensland, in Mareeba. My dad was a tobacco farmer. And we didn't stay there long because Dad had been there for an extended period. Mum was a city girl from Sydney, probably wasn't her environment. And so in the end, they moved to southwest Sydney to be closer to family. And Dad bought a poultry farm. And so we were on that poultry farm for, I think, over 3 decades. And it's, where I grew up, semi-rural. You were just close enough to sort of the city to get there on a daily basis. So I headed into school, finished my junior secondary and went on to a senior secondary school in the southwest. And fortunately, got a good enough result to go to Sydney Uni. And then it sort of, my world opened up after that. I never really had an inclination to go back to the farm and do farming. I found myself falling into literature and teaching and coaching, right? And that's where the sort of, I suppose, the leadership journey began.
Were you, as a kid, was it an environment, as an inclusive environment or a supportive environment from the folks in terms of education?
Oh, look, my dad had very limited educational opportunities, right? He was a kid who came from a very small European country, landed in Australia as a 15-year-old on his own, and he was a pioneer. He was an adventurer, right? And he sort of got here, worked in Sydney for a while, got enough money together to head north, worked on farms up there, and then finally bought his own property. So, I sort of admire that courage and that pioneering spirit. Mum, on the other hand, was well educated, right? And for her to leave Sydney and go to North Queensland was, such a juxtaposition. Finally, when they came back to Sydney, Mum then explored, her academic interests and went on to learn 5 languages. Worked at the University of Western Sydney. When she moved up here, worked at the University of Queensland. These days she's still providing sort of education for her community, lives on Bribie Island. And so for her, education was so important. I think she was probably more influential in her education than my dad. My dad understood it was important, but he saw the practical side of life.
Sounds like he was a good example of hard work, though.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You'd be able to witness that on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, as you know, the school's motto is nil sine labore, nothing without hard work, and I saw that on a daily basis. And, he would leave as the sun was coming up and he'd come back as the sun was going down, so there was a fair bit happening in his day. And, it was an enterprise. Poultry farming was a 24/7 occupation because in those days it wasn't necessarily automated. It was a manual process. And I got to learn about that as well because there were instances where I was providing the manual labour. So, you get to respect the fact that what he did provided us with, an education, the livelihood that he created for our family is something that I will always respect.
As a kid in school, were you the rat bag? Or?
Look, I probably wasn't the best behaved kid at school. I think I was bored, to be honest. I really enjoyed learning, but I was a bit selective in my learning in my early days. And coming off a farm, you tend to spend a lot of time outside. So it took me a while to adjust to sitting and being still for a period of time. I was more inclined to be outside, playing sport and and doing those sorts of things.
Not that I wanted to preempt that answer, but I suspected that was the case. From the limited amount of time I've spent with you, I could always tell that you had a soft spot or an understanding for the kids who are otherwise, who aren't perfect, who are, let's say, bored at some capacity, right? You're able to, I don't know, whether it's a challenge as a teacher or a challenge as a leader in the school, to go, okay, you're not, like, you're just misdirected.
Yeah, look, I think you can always channel young people's energy. I was fortunate along the way. I can think of 3 teachers who did that for me. One was in primary school, one was in junior secondary, and the other one was in senior secondary. So the one in primary school really gave us an opportunity to lead, because he knew I was overly enthusiastic. So he'd give me responsibility, right? And I found with responsibility came this really interesting desire to lead authentically, so to do it properly, in other words, because this guy was putting trust in me, right? And I had a responsibility not just to myself, but to others. In junior secondary, I came across a teacher who, really did direct me towards using whatever skills I had and doing it with passion and really meaning what you do. And then in senior secondary, I had an English teacher who just taught me about literature, and I fell in love with it.
So you've been at the school for 30 years.
31.
31.
Yeah. I arrived, I think it was July 1993.
First as an English teacher.
Correct.
Then you progressively go through different iterations of essentially leadership. Head of year, deputy, and now in the headmaster's role. Describe to me the moment that you were told that you'd get that top job.
Look, I never thought I'd be in that role. I'm not someone that's planned my career. It's more happenstance, right? So, even coming to Queensland, it was because my wife was from Brisbane. She lived in Sydney for a couple of years with me when we got married. I think she found Sydney hectic and wanted to come back to Brisbane and be close to her family. For me, it was a bit of an adventure. I thought, okay, well, I can pack up and move to Brisbane. Sounds okay. I had no work. So we arrived here, I think it was the 1st of January 1990, right? And within the space of 2 weeks, I had a job. I went and worked at St. Columban's at Albion. In those days, it was a small Catholic school. It was fantastic. The people there were, they were prepared to work collaboratively, and they had a mission. They were working for the boys in that school. They were working collectively and collaboratively, and those people are still some of my best friends. There's a handful of us, about 10 of us, who meet regularly, get together, right? And we've remained connected all of that time. I applied for the job at Brisbane Grammar School initially because Catholic education were talking about closing St. Columban's, right? And they did in the end. They moved to Caboolture. So I applied for an English job at Brisbane Grammar School and fortunate enough to get it. And I think part of my coaching background contributed to that, because I remember the headmaster at the time, Peter Lennox, saying to me, look, and we do want you to coach cricket, and this is what it looks like. And eventually we think if you go well, you'll probably coach the first. Now, I didn't really know what that meant, to be honest. I got a job as an English teacher. I arrived at Brisbane Grammar School and I was immediately amazed by the quality of the students, in the sense that they really respected learning, right? And I felt challenged at first, because I felt like I needed to be ahead of the game so that I could contribute to their development. You asked me the question about, did I ever think I would be the headmaster, and what did it feel like when I was told? You get that moment of elation, and then you get that moment of terror, right? It's like you've applied for the job, you think you know what it's all about, but you really don't know what you don't know, right? And you get to that point and there's this sheer exhilaration. And there was a period where couldn't tell anyone, because the school has to go through a process of notifying the various authorities, communicating that to the community, right? So other than my wife, no one else knew, right? And so that was quite a protracted period.
How long were we talking?
I was notified in December, and it was the following February when it was announced.
Wow.
So,
and is that a phone call from the trustees? How does that?
Met in person with the chairman at the time, and he told me. And as I say, I was elated. It's a school that I love. It's a place I really enjoy working at. I don't have a problem coming to the on a daily basis because I feel it's an exercise and expression of who I am. And when he did tell me, there was sheer exhilaration. And then when you begin to process, there's also, okay, what don't I know? What do I have to learn in the next 12 months in order to be prepared for this role? And I was fortunate because I had an extended transition. So from February right through to December, the headmaster was teaching me things and mentoring me along the way. So when I finally moved into the role in 2014, I'd have 12 months, right, of understanding what the role was all about. And I was pretty fortunate at the time because there was also a business manager or CFO who was prepared to teach me aspects of the business. And so I've worked with two CFOs. Both of them have been extraordinary. One taught me about insurance and risk. The other person's taught me all about the business model and taught me, a lot of things about how business operates and, the decision making and the timing of certain decisions. Like if you pull one lever, it affects another. So I really feel quite fortunate in the sense that I've been well looked after by those two CFOs and by the former head who was prepared to invest in me and share his knowledge and then continue to do so even when I was in my first year in the role. I'd meet him on a monthly basis and we'd go through what's working and what's not working. So that mentoring really set me up for success. And I think that's one of the strengths of Brisbane Grammar School is that people are prepared to share their knowledge. Right? There's a very strong understanding that collaboration makes us stronger, and that was exhibited in my transition to the role.
What do you think? There's been so many teachers over the space of 30 years that have gone through the gates there. Why you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think because I had good training along the way. Brisbane Grammar School's big enough for you to do a number of roles over an extended period. My greatest strength is probably resilience and perseverance. As I said earlier, the appointments were all happenstance, I arrived as an English teacher. I was fortunate to be appointed to a couple of managerial type roles of different things. So a master in charge of a particular sport or a manager of the first team. Then I was appointed the first 11 coach for a number of years. So, through those roles, you're exhibiting certain skills that are transferable to these more senior roles, everything from managing relationships right through to the technical aspects of whatever the activity might be. I think the head of year role is one of the most extraordinary roles that anyone can do, right? And, you and I have an association that goes back to those early 2000s. And when you've got a group of, it was 269 boys in that year group. And if you recall, I took over midway through, right? So I think it was year 10. So trying to establish a rapport with a group when, they've been previously used to somebody else leading them, that was quite challenging in itself. But getting to know people and getting to understand their motivations, that builds that rapport. And then you have that level of trust. And then you're able to channel the energy of the group in a certain way. And what I liked about that group was that, there were strong personalities, there were people who were prepared to question. And so in many respects, the boys taught me about my leadership, right? It wasn't one way or the highway. There were multiple ways, and I had to learn how to adjust those leadership skills in order to provide those boys with a pathway, right? And as you know, they've all gone in, a multitude of directions. But that head of year role teaches you from, exhilaration to exasperation on that continuum on any given day, right? And you really do get a sense of my role is to empower people. My role is to find ways to enable this person to be the best they can be. So it set me up really well to become the deputy, because as a deputy headmaster of students, you are pretty much the operational manager of the school. You are dealing with most of the conflict. You're dealing with situations where you're working with the young leaders of tomorrow. But then you've also got a large group of kids who are prepared to do their own thing and do it with a minimum of fuss. So you've got to make sure you don't miss them either, right? And then there's a group of kids who are struggling for whatever reason, and so you're investing a fair bit of time in them. And then you've got a small group of boys who, misguided and have taken the path less travelled, and you're trying to bring them back on track. So it really does give you a broad set of leadership skills which then allow you to perhaps do the top job. So, a long-winded response to your question, but I felt like I learnt along the way and I exhibited the skills that were going to perhaps set me up for success in the senior role.
As you progressed through those years of the different areas where your leadership and that skill is getting honed, are you actively reflecting as to how you're progressing, or are you improving? Because I imagine there's lots of head of years, there's lots of first 11 coaches, but I feel like your strengths, it sounds like the real strength is that you are becoming stronger as a leader, better as a leader, and yes, happenstance has occurred, but that you're not forcing any progression through the school, but it's opening up because presumably you are like almost on a compounding effect. You're quickly adapting and learning. Was that a
Yeah, look, I think when I was younger, perhaps I was far more impulsive, right? It's probably something that I've had to work on my whole life, making decisions after thought processes which are informed. I think when I was younger, I'd snap to a decision. Along the way, I became far more self-reflective. So when I look at my time at Brisbane Grammar School, I know I'm now a better teacher. I'm definitely a better learner. I'm a far better leader, right? And, if I'm to be brutally honest, I'm probably a better person, right? So all of those things have been shaped along the way. And so, the rough diamond may now be smooth, but there's probably still a little bit more work to do, I think.
Your ability to see weakness within yourself and then continue to invest in learning has been really impressive to see and inspiring to see. So when you in that deputy role and going into headmaster, you're thinking, okay, I'm good at some aspects, but I definitely need improvement.
Yeah.
So talk to me about what you learned in the extracurricular or the education piece. You went to Harvard, you went to Switzerland. What are you learning from there in terms of high performance and leadership?
I learned that to make informed decisions, you really needed to invest in your knowledge. You couldn't make good decisions based upon scant information. Now, sometimes that information comes from experts, but I always found that I was prepared to listen and listen intently to experts in their field, but I needed to go and do my own research. I needed to be able to ask the right questions. Right. So earlier I talked about the business side of the school. I asked copious questions of those two CFOs along the way, and when I didn't understand, I asked again. Right. Because if I've got an understanding of what's going on, then I'm able to empower other people to do their jobs well. Right. So I'm not someone who micromanages, but I am someone who likes to know. Right? I like to be across the whole organisation. I like to know what's happening in the whole school, right? I think I've gotten better at, if I see an issue brewing, I'll address it straight away, right? And I think it's one of the challenges of leadership is we see conflict emerging, but in our early days as leaders, we're less inclined to step in and try and do something about it. Now, I've stepped in previously where I probably made it worse, right? But over time, you learn strategies which allow you to navigate and maneuver your way through those circumstances because in the end, you want a win-win, right? And I think when I was young, it was win-lose, right? Because that competitive nature comes out in all of us, right? We want to win. But I think when you're dealing with people and you're in education, you want to see everybody win. Right, I love watching my staff succeed. Right, they there's a faculty at Brisbane Grammar School that extraordinary people, and their investment in the kids is what brings me to school every day because I know they care. Right, and then I love watching the kids progress from year 5 or year 7 right through to the school, and then watch them graduate as young men. For me, that's success. That's what success looks like, and I say to people, I think I do my best leadership in the shadows where you're communicating with people and giving them ideas, but you're not telling them. You're inviting them to explore a number of strategies themselves. And then when they come back to you and say, well, I did this and it worked and that worked really well, I say, well, what didn't work? Oh, I could have done this differently. Okay, great. Right, so I like seeing people stretched, feeling the pressure a little bit, but then succeeding and standing in the limelight.
But giving them the ability or,
Well, giving them the resources and the support.
yeah, to go and stretch themselves,
Yeah.
right? Not to say you need to do this and take on this responsibility because I'm telling you,
Yeah.
but to take that on your own volition.
Yeah. And sometimes it's, someone's doing extremely well in a particular role, but you just turn them a little bit. Say, well, look, if we did it this way, what impact do you think it might have? Because I think the worst thing in education is that people rinse and repeat. And, if you always do it that way, you always get the same outcomes. And so I'm really committed to continuous improvement in whatever we do. So whether it's in the classroom or on the playing field or the concert hall, I want to see that we're improving, because that not only elevates outcomes for the students, it also elevates level of satisfaction for the staff, right? And for the parents, it gives them enormous satisfaction to watch their children succeed.
Talk to me then about the first year in the job.
I always say to people, and I do presentations for aspiring principals and heads, and I always say the first year for me was about proving to myself I could do the job, right? So, really investing in what I didn't know, right, rather than defaulting to what I knew. So I knew how to manage the school, I knew the operations, I knew that, but there was a whole raft of things that I didn't know. Even things like your relationship with the board, right? That whole governance piece, understanding how the dynamics of that, how that works, understanding that as the school's leader, I'm responsible for the management of the school, and good, bad, or indifferent, there needs to be a level of transparency with the board, because often they have a level of expertise where they can assist you in good and bad times, right? So, learning that piece was interesting. So that first year was a challenge in many respects, because when you're appointed from within, there are certain relationships that change. You go from being perhaps a part of a friendship group to all of a sudden being in charge of the decisions, right? So you're deploying resources across the school, and it might be a sector who you were very friendly with who don't get everything they want. So all of a sudden the relationship changes a little bit. And that first year can be pretty lonely in the sense that you feel like you're making the right decisions. You're not getting a lot of feedback because you're still in that honeymoon period, right? And people think, okay, well, he's the right person for the job, and we'll make an assessment of his leadership over time. So that first year can be quite challenging in that regard.
The vision being the very best school for boys in Australia, you would have had your own take, and presumably you would have had that mapped out in your application to the role. This is how you're going to progress the school. How did you effectively go, okay, there would have been a leadership team already established in Brian's time, but how did you form your senior leadership team in that first year?
Well, I think in that first year, it was a case of establishing the group dynamics, formulating a charter. This is how we're going to behave as a group, respecting that these are our roles, but sometimes there will be interdependencies, right? And that we might cross into each other's paths, setting up clear guidelines for how do we manage demarcation disputes.
And are you having conversations like this freely at meetings?
Early in the piece, yes, because I needed to try and establish what may work, right? And I was prepared to accept feedback that, a certain approach may not be acceptable, right? And so then I had to be malleable in the sense of shifting where I thought things should have been, because these are highly experienced people, and previously I was one of their peers, and now all of a sudden I'm in charge, right? So there was a period where people had to adjust, and I had to adjust, and I had to be respectful of people taking a little bit of time to adjust to my leadership style, because my style tends to be affiliative, right? It's not authoritarian. I like to give people the resources to do the job well, and I'd rather walk shoulder to shoulder with them than in front of them.
Mm-hmm. With the kids, how do you balance academic excellence as a goal with their emotional intelligence? This question probably wouldn't have been asked 30 years ago, but it is more prevalent now.
I think they're symbiotic. You need to have a very strong student culture. Right? You need to have a school culture where people feel safe. That's the first thing. you need to have a school culture, and I'm talking about staff and students. You need to have a school culture where there is a strong belief in the well-being of everybody. And like I spend quite a bit of time these days thinking about staff well-being, right? Because I think we've got the student well-being right, but teaching's now in a phase. It's a period where the profession is under scrutiny, and I think teachers are feeling the cognitive load that goes with that. So I think a lot about staff well-being and ways that I might be able to change what we do to support them so that they can continue to support the boys.
Yeah, Simon Sinek talked about like leadership is not about being in charge. It is about taking care of those in your charge.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about,
how
to support them.
And so, your comment about social and emotional well-being, Brisbane Grammar School's invested a huge amount of time and resources in that. And I think it goes back to Peter Lennox and the heads of year, the early heads of year, who established what was called then a pastoral care system, right? And then the next wave of heads of year, like myself and Jackie Zervos and Ian Short and Bill Henderson and those guys came along, and we changed it from pastoral care to student wellbeing. And that was the sort of the first inkling that we're moving away from one model, right, to a new model where we're trying to be far more proactive, right, and beginning to understand what the boys needed at different stages of their development and developing a curriculum which spirals from year 5 right through to year 12, but also putting programs in place which allow them to examine their own leadership style, looking at the role of boarding and outdoor education, how do we connect those things, and then also looking at things like health services. So schools had all of these programs operating in silos, and then, I think probably 20 years ago we started saying, well, hang on a second, they're not silos, they're all providing a level of care. How do we centralise these things so that boys know that it's all for their well-being, right? So the curriculum is designed to give them information. The structures that we have put in place are designed to give them people that they can go to in an hour of need. The various systems we have in place are to make sure that no one falls through the cracks, right? The support mechanisms you put in place may be used at a certain time, but then they may not be used. It's really about making certain that your whole organisation understands its primary purpose. Our primary purpose is to educate young men to become good citizens, full stop, right? Because if they're good citizens, then you create that virtuous cycle, right? They go on to be good citizens who contribute to their communities, their families, right? They understand the whole purpose of altruism, right? And so all of a sudden you feel as if you have this proliferation of what's good in the world, right? And so that notion or that paradigm of school culture or student culture sits at the base of good academic outcomes. Because the primary thing for every student, single sex, co-ed, whatever, is they've got to have a sense of belonging. So if they belong to the place, they feel safe, they know they can talk to people, they know they can express a view and it'll be heard, right? Invariably, their contribution will be greater.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I find at the school which impresses me the most is the way the boys collaborate. They share their knowledge. And I see it with the staff as well, extraordinary levels of sharing in order to make everyone better.
You talked about nothing without hard work. What's your personal view on happiness in relation to life's journey?
Yeah, look, I'm an eternal optimist. Even in a dark moment, I can usually find humour. And I've had to deal with some tragedies along the way. But what resonates with me is I can always see the good side of things, and I can see the opportunities that exist. So even out of difficult circumstances, you can look at your context and say, what could I do differently? What could we do differently in order to make sure that doesn't happen again? Now, you can never guarantee certain things won't happen again, but you can put things in place which will mean that you can manage those situations better in the future. For me, happiness is being at school, right? I think the staff and the boys keep me reasonably young, although I'm aging rapidly. Happiness is actually seeing them mature, the boys mature and then graduate. And I said it earlier, I get enormous joy out of watching our staff, their professional growth, right? And, I don't like to lose any of my good staff, but some of them get promoted and go on to other schools. And I think that's fabulous for the profession and for other communities because they're getting high quality people.
Yeah, there's something to be said about seeing them as human and being stoked for their development, even if it's outside of the grounds.
Yeah. Look, and I will say I'm always happy when my team wins as well.
Sure. What processes have you put in place? Because I can imagine, even talking off air about all the camps, school holidays, there's no downtime. There's all these camps that are on, and the kids are out, and you're getting briefed or information. How do you manage the day-to-day distractions as the headmaster or someone in charge with such a large organisation, or so many people, staff and students? How do you step away from the weeds and understand what's important?
I think I said it earlier, when you've got a leadership team like we have at Brisbane Grammar School, those people are more than adept at running their patch, right? So there's a really high level of trust. I'm confident that the academic side, the co-curricular side, the wellbeing side of the school is being managed by people who know what they're doing. So as I said earlier, my role is to empower them, provide them with the resources they need. I like to be informed. When things go wrong, I stand shoulder to shoulder with them and we fix it. And my mantra is, it doesn't hurt to get things wrong because you learn a lot from that. It's just we can't get it wrong twice, right?
Got to learn from it.
Yeah, and even if we do get it wrong twice, what have we learned from that? What can we do next time, right? So, yeah, I think that you have these good people around you. You give them the resources they need. You trust that they'll do it, right? And you can step away. There are people who can step into my role because I see my role as making certain that there's enough people at school who can do my job, right? Because then you have a succession plan in place. The organisation is going to continue to do well. I think it was my dad always said to me, you've got to be a responsible tourist, right? And what he meant by that was don't leave it any worse than you found it, or perhaps even leave it better, right? So, if you go somewhere, pick up your own rubbish and put it in the bin. You've enjoyed that environment. Same at a school. You want to leave something that empowers other people to do the job well. So for me, I'm now at a point where I'm looking at all of our processes and our systems. Are they sustainable? The school's grown from, say, 1,200 when you were there. It's now nearly 2,000, right? I think its capacity is probably 2,200. So when we get to that point, what structures and systems might break? What other things do we need in place to make certain that the school will continue to thrive? What other resources do we need to make sure that the teachers will continue to feel as if they can contribute to the wellbeing of the boys and their academic development? So I look at things like generative AI. What tools could we use which remove the administrative burden for teachers and allow them to do what they're good at, which is teaching? Because teaching is a complex activity. It's art and science. There's the art, the feel of it, right, and the science, which is the technical and the pedagogical approach. So, what can I do as a school leader to take away some of those burdensome activities which allow people to do their jobs well, right? And so, we're exploring that at the moment.
Quote from Martin Luther King was, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moments of comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy.
Yep.
Even from an outsider, in the last 10 years, you've directed, whether it's capital improvements and development on the grounds, but the whole thing has just been really impressive to see. And coming onto the campus a few years ago and understanding your senior leadership team, it's nothing short of impressive. But talk to me about the more difficult moments.
Look, the more difficult moments always involve people. The schools are wonderful places when the people are there. And I spend a lot of time at Grammar during holidays, and it's just a collection of buildings. It's just hard infrastructure. But that first day back when the kids are on campus and the staff are on campus and you can hear the banter and you can hear the noise, that's what I particularly like. So those challenging moments, everyone knows the school was involved in part of a royal commission. You're dealing with something which is historical. It's really hard to reconcile, all right? Because what happened historically was perhaps because there weren't systems in place to safeguard the well-being of the boys. And I'm not going to comment on the past because I wasn't there. That would be completely unfair. But you learn from that, right? And part of my responsibility is to meet those men, those survivors, and talk with them. Now, from a personal point of view, I find that distressing. But I also feel as if I've got a role to play in their closure, in their healing, right? Now, they might say that I was useless and it wasn't that effective, but along the way, there have been some who've actually said, really appreciate you being here.
Has that been the hardest part of the last 10 years?
Yeah.
There's no playbook
No.
on how to deal with the Royal Commission and the fallout of that?
No.
And at the early stages, are you bringing that senior leadership team in and talking about the best way forward with this and how do we manage this as a group?
Yeah, so I think what I learned from those conversations is that child protection is in perpetuity. Like the moment you become complacent, somebody or something will slip through the cracks. So, we've invested a lot of time and energy in child protection as a school responsibility. So everybody from the groundsman through to me has a responsibility for child protection. So it's about putting structures in place where kids know they can go and have conversations with people and they know they'll be heard. It won't be discarded as, that's just boys being boys or, oh, that's just him. To me, that's important because, as I said earlier, if the kids feel safe and have a sense of belonging, the outcomes are better. You get survival, you get people thriving rather than just surviving.
Yeah.
I would say that's been the most difficult part of it. The loss of a colleague was extremely difficult. Someone that I knew extremely well, the circumstances surrounding that, that was quite painful because there were people who would say it was my fault in some respects because, I had to take a certain course of action and unfortunately it led to a tragic outcome.
It's a difficult period of time for the school and you as the head of it because you've got to deal with real survivors. These are real events, as you said, not in your time, not in anyone's time at the school, but it's history. And you've got this position of trying to support, to some degree, them as old boys. You've got to uphold the best images you possibly can for the brand of the school. And you've got an obligation currently, as you say, and in perpetuity, of this education piece for the current boys and future boys, and the teachers and the staff on ground. How did you manage through that? And do you feel like I know that it's ongoing, but does it sit heavily with you?
I've spent time reflecting on this. I'm very good at compartmentalizing. Now, whether I've fully rationalized those feelings in my head is a completely different question. But I am good at understanding what the context is and what the response should be. So, I always feel as if it's not what happened, it's what happens next. Right? What happened is vitally important to those people, right? But it's the response from the school that's more important.
That's in your control.
Yeah. So this is the bit that I can do something about, and I feel as if I'm making a positive contribution in that regard. Now, not every one of those men will feel that way because all of their circumstances are different. But I feel it's important that I need to front up and be the face of the school and make that apology.
Certainly something that you didn't expect to have to go through.
Well, it goes back to my comment about you don't know what you don't know. So when I applied for the job, I heard there was a Royal Commission coming. But did I fully understand that it would involve Brisbane Grammar School? No. You guys were in year 12 when that first hit the press, right? And I was your head of year. My job then was to keep you guys informed. I remember speaking to you guys as a year group and saying, this is what happened as we know it, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. This is what we have in place now. If any of you experience, if it doesn't feel right, it's wrong. So tell someone about it. Right? And so my job was to educate you guys as the seniors of the school and talk to you about your responsibility as the seniors to take care of the younger students. when I became the deputy, then my role was slightly different. My role was to write policy and to follow legislation, put practices in place, appoint people to certain roles to make sure that they had a child protection role within the school, speak to the parents, keep them informed, help them understand what avenues they have. Right? And so it was a slightly different role in that regard. But then as the head, you've got to make sure all of those policies, processes and practices are in place, that they're reviewed regularly, right, that you're meeting all legislation. Right? I've been asked on multiple occasions to talk at sort of law panels and law conferences about the school's experience. It's not something I want to be renowned for, I can tell you.
Going forward, what keeps you up at night?
The cost of education, the cost. So, I love the fact that Brisbane Grammar School was established on sort of egalitarian grounds. There were people who came together and donated and pulled the community together to build a school. I think how extraordinary was that back in the 1860s, right? Schools are getting hugely expensive. Independent schools are seeing a decline in recurrent funding from government because newspapers tend to run the class warfare story. You'll see that as recurrent funding comes down, the cost of education goes up. Now, I still think that teachers are underpaid. Right? They do an extraordinary job. They are basically nurturing and forming the future of our world. There's a lot of disparaging remarks made about the teaching profession. I think what people don't realise is when teachers get to a holiday, they fall in a heap. Right? It's not like they're swanning around on a Greek island. If they do venture to a Greek island, it's usually to lie on a towel and recover. So yeah, that's my greatest concern is the cost.
Okay. And what do you think the biggest challenges are going forward in your role?
Oh, look, I think education's going to continue to change. You see, we continue to operate in an industrial model, right? So education was originally formulated to educate the upper class and the middle class. And then when it became elementary schooling, it was really to contain the masses, right? In a modern context, we are still very much looking after other people's children, but at a much higher standard, right? And so when I say it's an industrial model, there's no flexibility in that. You have to have high quality people, genuine people who genuinely care in front of somebody else's child, right? And you want to do a good job for all of them. Now, sometimes you might come up a bit short. And the challenge these days is people are prepared to bash teachers in the press on a daily basis. I was reading about it this morning, that people are leaving the profession because they don't feel valued.
On a personal note, how do you find balance and happiness in your own life?
I'm not good at resting. So people would describe me as restless. I often think about what will I be like when I'm not at Brisbane Grammar School and I will need something else to occupy my time, because I can't ever see myself retiring from doing something constructive. Now, I might go back to club sports and try and contribute in that way in a voluntary sense. I don't see myself ever running another school, because after you run a school like Brisbane Grammar School, it's like, what do I do? I don't really want to do another school. I might contribute in education. I don't want to be a consultant. Right? I don't want to go into other schools and tell people how to do things. Right? But I'd be prepared to support individuals if that was what was required. I get a lot of joy out of being with my own family. Right? I probably need to get my handicap down because it's blown out. So they're the things I'd probably do.
Do you think that because you're so fulfilled in the role that none of it feels like work?
Yeah, look, I occasionally run out of bandwidth.
Okay.
So I get to the point, and it's usually at the end of terms, where you feel like your staff feel a bit fatigued.
Need a couple of days.
Yeah. But, I recover from that pretty quickly. I get a lot of joy, as I said, at being at school. And sort of the thought of retiring is in the distance, but not yet.
And how has your relationship with yourself developed over the years, do you think?
Yeah.
Because you talked about at the start that through the 30-year experience, you are a better person. How is that? How have you shaped that?
I think I'm more empathetic, right? Because you begin to understand as you get older that people's grievances have some validity, right? And so when you're younger, you go, oh, look, I can't deal with this. But as you get older, you're more prepared to stop, listen, understand, and then try and help. You can't fix everything. And I do like to fix things. So every now and then when I try and it fails, that doesn't sit well with me because I'm always looking for the win-win. But as you get older, you develop greater empathy. I have a much deeper appreciation for the contribution that other people make because you go from being young, you can be a bit egotistical, to being older, you become more altruistic. So I get a lot of satisfaction out of sort of trying to help others, but I don't want the notoriety. It makes me feel uncomfortable.
How do you, when you talked about the win-win and you don't, I guess failure doesn't sit well with you, what's your process with pivoting versus persisting in those circumstances?
Yeah, look, I, again, got much better at doing that. So previously, if I failed, I might have dwelled on it for too long. Now I understand, okay, well, I've got to make a turn here. It's not an end point, it's a turning point. And that's how I rationalise it in my mind. There's some parts of what I just did, which worked, other parts didn't, hence it failed. Here's an opportunity to change direction and contribute to whatever the circumstance might be.
Would you have done anything different in the last 10 years, the last 30 years? Or do you see those sort of lessons as just an avenue to learn?
No, it's a good question in the sense that, I can pick specific moments where I may have done things differently, certain decisions. But overall, I think I've been reasonably happy with the way things have gone. Like school feels and looks good.
Certainly does. And then what does the next decade? This has been 10 years. And I spoke to I was interviewing someone who said that, if you reflected on the last 10 years and you knew what you went through, at the start of that 10 years, you wouldn't believe you had the strength to get through it, but you find the strength.
Yep.
So what does the next 10 look for you? You've dealt with things that potentially you didn't expect to deal with, whether it's COVID or whether it's the commission or whatever the situation is, but you got through it.
Yeah, look, I get through most things, the
resilience.
I do bounce back pretty quickly. Do you get bruised along the way? Yeah, of course you do. And I think sometimes people may think that I'm not bruised because I've got that sort of cool and calm exterior. Someone said to me recently, you always look calm, but you're paddling frantically below the waterline, So, but the next 10 years, at some point, I suspect it'll be time to walk away. It'll be time to spend more time with my family and my friends. Probably a time to look back and say, well, I made a contribution and I'm proud of it.
Yeah. You mentioned you're aging fast. I think it's the Mediterranean skin. I think you're younger than you were 25 years ago. But anyway.
Yeah.
Before you go, the last 5 questions. What does success mean to you?
I think I've answered this. It's, watching other people succeed. That's the best.
Happiness? What does happiness mean to you? First day back.
I go back to my family that, my family have health and well-being and that my kids can hopefully own their own properties one day. And I think I made the point earlier about grandparents contributing to education. I think we're heading into a period where grandparents are going to contribute to a whole range of things.
Number 1 book you'd be wanting to gift or recommend?
Oh, look, I love To Kill a Mockingbird.
You are the English teacher.
I taught it.
Was that or Animal Farm?
I taught it for 20 years, and I just love that character. So,
great answer. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting some leadership book.
No.
I actually got my 10-year-old on he reads like you couldn't believe at 10. I've introduced him to Lord of the Flies.
Right. Okay.
But To Kill a Mockingbird is a great one, and Animal Farm as well.
Animal Farm and Catcher in the Rye, Catch-22.
22, beautiful. 4 guests, not family or friends, you'd invite to dinner who could be alive or have already passed.
Definitely Leonardo da Vinci. Just an extraordinary inventor, artist. I'd just love to know what he was thinking. Nelson Mandela, because I'd want to know what he was thinking about in that period of incarceration. Muhammad Ali,
It's good.
Right, Muhammad Ali, because, it wasn't just the boxer standing up for his beliefs, that whole period of changing faith, right? And then the years afterwards, when he was no longer a prominent figure. Probably Anthony Hopkins, the actor. And he just played such a diverse roles throughout his career.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be really interested to sit down and talk to him about, how do you prepare for those different roles, and how do you make people believe that you're authentic when you're acting?
Love that. I love that. And then finally, a guest who you would recommend or suggest that we have on the show.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. There's a grammar old boy who I think does some extraordinary stuff, charity work, volunteers a lot of his time for various organisations. Well, his name's Brett Clark, and he's currently chair of QRU, and he's on Queensland Ballet, I think, and he's on the Olympics committee, and
Yeah, right.
He was the founder of Chemist Warehouse, and just extraordinary breadth of things that he's done in a relatively shorter period of time. He's in his early 50s, and yeah, he's a very interesting character.
All right, Anthony Micallef, thank you so much for your time, for coming up on up the Bruce to sit down, and it's been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it, Richard, and obviously our connection goes back a long way. But from my point of view, it's great to see you now nearly 40, is that right? With your own practice and your own family. Yeah, that's a sign of success.
Thank you, mate. That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're at school assembly, turn to the person next to you and let them know all about the show. And if you really enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It means everything. Until next time, peace.